moving along here. Guy, does GDPR require consent by individuals for any and all data processing?
So that's pretty much what the GDPR says. You know, in effect, you shouldn't be processing any personal data without having achieved the consent of the data subjects affected. And so this gets really interesting because it's not only consent anymore. You know, there's terms used such as explicit consent or free consent. You know, it's not just about, well, you know, they went to that web page and I managed to monitor that they went to that web page. So because they went to that web page, I think they probably consented to us using their information. It's none of that anymore unless a data subject has explicitly demonstrated a yes. And the fact is also you need to have a record of that, and we'll speak about record keeping a little later. You are pretty much not permitted to be processing any of that data. But the whole idea of consent goes a little bit further, and it speaks about what about consent for children? You know, and we've got two issues here. The one is the age of 13, like you would have under the US's COPPA regulation. So, you know, like if you're on Twitter or Facebook or something, you know, as long as you're 13 and older, I think, you know, you're perfectly okay to jump onto Facebook. But if you're younger than that, you can't. Initially, the age of consent was proposed to be 16 years old.
Wow.
I think certainly Neil could certainly add to this because I think a lot of the decision making for particular member states around that age of consent, I think, has been left up to those member states. Neil,
you're absolutely right, Guy. It is left up to member states, and it's interesting that you raised this very important aspect of GDPR because, for example, there was a significant debate here in Ireland when Data Protection Act was being considered by the Irish Parliament. And for a while, it was thought that they were going to have the age of consent at 13. But ultimately, what came onto the statute books was that parental consent is required up to the age of 16. So it's 16 in Ireland. It'll be different in other countries. I believe it's 13 in, for example, Belgium. So each member state, yes, will have different age requirements.
Very
right.
interesting. I think Robin has a question as well.
So I've got a question here. I was thinking while I was listening to you both speak, for an e-commerce merchant, how would consent operate? Would it be I've clicked purchase on the shopping cart and I've put my credit card information and I've processed? Would that be deemed consent? Would consent be considered to have been given if I abandon my cart? You know, because there are applications in e-commerce where people will use that abandoned shopping cart information now to go out and to nurture or to try and interact with that particular customer.
So certainly I could start and Neil certainly jump in, but the answer is no. And it comes down to explicit consent. So what data is it? What are you planning to use that data for? I mean, none of those questions will have been asked, you know, just by having an abandoned shopping cart or just because you've made a purchase. So in fact, it comes down to the explicit consent that, you know, we will be using your data to do X, Y, Z, and we'll delete it after X, or we're not going to do this, or we're not going to do that, until you've seen that kind of notification and you've clicked on that little click box, which is then explicit and free. In other words, not under duress. You effectively do not have, shall I use that term or phrase, the right to be processing that personal data.
Interesting.
Completely agree. Completely agree, Guy. Again, we have to remember that consent under GDPR must be informed and it must be freely given. So to pick up on what Guy was saying, that there can't be any element of duress or the individual who is giving consent must be aware how their data is going to be processed, and it basically comes down to informed consent.
So that's very interesting for somebody that's implementing, say, a Shopify Plus system in the UK or in Germany. where they're taking orders, if that explicit consent request is not part of the checkout process, then you potentially are in a violation of GDPR, from what I understand.
If you're going to be
Yes,
using that
potentially.
personal data, yep.
Okay.
Well, I can say from my side of things that that's a huge blind spot for e-commerce, especially in North America in relation to GDPR. Thank you for that question and those answers. All right.